My next guest on the show grew up idolizing all things flight. That was until he was 14 years old, and he says that his eyes were opened and he realized that the moon landing was actually a hoax. Bart Sibrel has worked for every major news organization you can think of: ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, TLC, USA. He's done work for them, and he's done award-winning work. And his life's work now is talking about how the moon landing is a hoax. Now, Bart wrote a book called Moon Man, and I would say that a third of that book is dedicated towards evidence of disproving the moon landing. A third of that book is dedicated towards his tales of espionage and how he was kidnapped by the CIA. And a third of that book is condemning the U.S. government and how each of these, if you want to call them conspiracy theories, although he would probably call himself a corruption theorist, how all these theories of corruption are interconnected.
Quite frankly, it's kind of unusual.
It's quite Franklin.
Got it. Quite Franklin.
Didn't know, Bart, that you're actually from Dayton, Ohio. You're born at Wright-Patterson.
Yep, I was.
Talk to me about that, because obviously your birthplace is going to somewhat, in my opinion, predetermine your interest in the subject at hand today.
Well, it's interesting. I do mention that in the book Moon Man, that myself and Neil Armstrong and the Wright brothers are all from the same town of Dayton, Ohio. And Ohio is generally considered to be the most important swing state during the presidential elections.
It is.
You know, if you were trying to pick a state that was the most representative of American culture, it might be Ohio. They say the Simpsons are from Ohio.
But when I read that in your book, I was like, oh, we're from the same area, because I live just south of that in Cincinnati, and I'm in Dayton all the time. So
yeah, my dad was in the Air Force, and he was, at the time I was born, stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And he was an officer in the Air Force. He did some secretive things over the years, and some conspiratorial things over the years, I'm sure you could say. So I was very familiar with the aerospace industry, with aircraft and things like that, and grew up as the biggest fan of the moon missions. I remember being 4 years old, and I was asleep at the time they allegedly walked on the moon. Nevertheless, afterwards, because my father was an officer, he got like a VIP package of these 9x12 color pictures from Apollo 11, about 20 of them. So he gave them to me as a gift. I put them up on my bedroom wall, and I saw those pictures every day for 10 years in a row. That's 3,650 times, and thought it was the greatest thing. And then when I saw Bill Casing on television when I was 14, he's a gentleman who worked for Rocketdyne, which is a contractor for Apollo. He worked there for 6 years developing the Apollo program, and he was a technical writer, and he had very high security clearances because he would proof confidential memos going from generals to various people in the Pentagon, back to NASA and all the contractors, to kind of correct their grammar and make them look a little bit more educated than they really were. And he saw a memo from von Braun to address to somebody at the Pentagon, who said the likelihood of going to the moon successfully on the first attempt with 1960s technology, he put at 1 in 10,000.
How old were you when you heard this from Bill Casing? You were still a young kid.
Yeah, I was 14 years old, and that kind of planted a seed in my mind. So I went back to my bedroom wall with the pictures on it, and sure enough, it's like it was hidden in plain sight, or my eyes were wide closed, and I began to see, at least in the early prints, they've corrected them since then, but in the early prints, the soil was a very kind of caramel brown, and the background of the alleged mountains, which were actually projections, was kind of a gray blue. They, a few years later, corrected that. They put a blue filter over them and rephotographed them, and now the sand is blue of the soil, and then the background's blue, so they match. But in the ones I had, there was a very distinct line where the fake backdrops began, but I never noticed it before. And then even in that famous picture, allegedly, of Aldrin on the moon with his arm bent, there's a lot of inconsistencies in that. The primary one that people just overlook is that there's wrinkles all in his spacesuit. Now, you have to ask yourself, how many wrinkles are in a balloon? There aren't any because the thing's inflated. So the fact that there's all these wrinkles in there proves it's not even compressed with air. It's a representation of it. And so that kind of planted the seed. And 10 years later, I had become a filmmaker. I started out as an actor and then a playwright and then became a filmmaker. And I was editing one day a project for the gentleman who had produced that television show I'd seen 10 years earlier as a 14-year-old with Bill Casey on it. So I asked him, I said, hey, remember that guy in your show who said we didn't go to the moon? What's his name? He said, I don't remember, but call the San Francisco production office. So I did. And they said, had I called a day or two later, I would have never been able to find out who he was because they were deleting all 10-year-old material to make room for newer projects. So I called up Bill and we started talking, becoming friends. And that's when he first suggested, as a filmmaker, that I do a film about the fake moon landing. So I basically paid myself a salary for 6 months to do some preliminary research and found out that 2 of the 3 astronauts on the first, important mission never give interviews, which I thought was kind of odd. And then the Soviets, I didn't realize this, for every 100 hours we spent in space, they spent 500 hours.
Yeah, hang on. On the Soviet comment, let's back up real quick because let's start with, oftentimes when you talk about I just want to say this, your book Moon Man is really more about, to me, when I read it, is more about government corruption than it was conspiracy theory. So oftentimes when you start citing these things, and we'll get into the shadows and the spacesuits and we'll go in depth on that. And you can show the pictures on the podcast here as well. But because people have seen this and it's like, yeah. Let's take a step back real quick and let's talk about the technological, geopolitical landscape of everything that was going on. And let's, I guess if we were in a courtroom, because as I was reading your book, I'm thinking, okay, what kind of evidence here is very, say, damning evidence to the crime? And what kind of evidence here is, say, circumstantial evidence to the crime? But I was thinking to myself, okay, for people to understand, if you really was going to make a leap and believe in this, in the conspiracy theory or the moon hoax or however you want to title this thing, I'll talk to it as government corruption at this point in time. And we all know that corruption exists at the smallest and highest levels. Take us back to Apollo 1, take us back to the space race, take us back to establish the motive as to why the United States would be willing to fake an entire moon landing. Well,
Kennedy was president at the time. And when Alan Shepard went up and went from coast to coast and I think he was in space for about 15 minutes. He didn't even make a single orbit of the Earth. And this was after the Soviets had already orbited the Earth completely. Not only were we second, we did a fraction of what they did. The Soviets had also launched, as you know, the first satellite, the first animal, the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, the first of 2 spacecraft simultaneously. And like I said, for every 100 hours that we spent in space, they spent 500 hours. They were very much more advanced than we were. Now, Kennedy is a politician, not a scientist. So, as you saw recently, our current president pulled out of Afghanistan without even informing the other nations who had troops there. You would think he would make that call, right? And Kennedy kind of made the same mistake. He just, without consulting his scientists, made this boast. Hey, we sent a guy up into space for 15 minutes. Why don't we try to go to the moon by the end of the decade? And the scientists, after he said that, are like, I think that's pushing reasonable accommodation here. And as of course, they can't go to the moon today. So how could they possibly go on the first attempt with 1/1,000th the computing power of a cell phone? All that to say, Kennedy used this analogy of, he was Irish, and he said there were these 2 boys, brothers, who wanted to challenge each other as they were off running around playing. And there was this big wall. And so one brother took the hat of the other brother and threw it over the wall. And he says, now you're forced to achieve this objective, to climb the wall. And he said by boasting before the entire world that they would go to the moon by the end of the decade, basically he felt would force us, to make it happen. And in fact, it was that boast that was the reason for the falsification, among other reasons. It was basically pride. As you know, the Bible says pride comes before a fall. And it's also the reason why people can't see the faked moon landing. I mean, I could show you one photograph that is and all the evidence you need that proves the fraud. However, there's simple logic. What they're claiming is that they went with 1960s technology that had 1/1,000th the computing power of a cell phone in all of NASA, that they went 1,000 times farther than NASA can go today with 5 decades more technology. I mean, for the first time in history, technology has gone backwards, which of course is impossible, which means the moon landings are fake.
To play the devil's advocate here, can NASA not go to the moon, or do they just choose to not go to the moon?
No, they can't, because they keep saying, they've said 10 times since 1969 that they would, quote, return to the moon in 5 years. And they've missed all of the 10 deadlines. In fact, they said, I think in 2017, that by 2019, they would have the Orion spacecraft orbiting the moon. They can't even do that. And then they said, we're going to be on the moon by 2024. And now they're saying they can't do that because the spacesuit doesn't work. The whole thing is bizarre. They admit they deliberately destroyed all of the moon technology, not only the hardware, they destroyed all the blueprints and all the electrical schematics. They destroyed them. Now, think about this. Let's just say Bill Gates built the first big computer. Okay. Now, the cost of going to the moon in today's dollars is $200 billion. Let's just say Bill Gates spent $200 billion building the big computer. It works. It's fantastic. It does what it does. Then he takes all of the designs and all of the hardware and throws them into a furnace and burns them up. Would anyone do that? Of course not. In fact, the B-52 was designed 70 years ago, and there's still 200 of them flying today for the United States Air Force. So the fact that they destroyed the moon hardware and the blueprints is actually proof of the fraud. Because if you really went to the moon, you would never destroy $200 billion worth of investment that you could use today to go to the moon. The fact that they did destroy it is proof that they're covering up the falsehood, because it could be proven technically that the rocket didn't have enough fuel to leave Earth orbit. The lunar module didn't have the capability to provide air conditioning on a bunch of car batteries, and that the computers were not fast enough to synchronize 0 miles per hour, leaving the moon, to 3,000 miles per hour orbiting in the command module, which if they missed by a tenth of a second, the crew would die.
I'll throw in alternative theories out here. Is it possible that the technology existed and the United States government doesn't want to disclose that, so they just say they destroyed everything?
I don't see how that makes sense. They claim they went to the moon to where it was commonplace. They did it 6 times and drove cars on the moon and played golf on the moon. I mean, if there was any technology ever invented, that you wanted to destroy, might be the atomic bomb. But did they destroy that? No. And within 10 years, atomic bombs were 100 times more powerful. This is the claim they're making. Okay, let's just say Toyota in 1969 claimed that they built a car that could go 50,000 miles on 1 gallon of gasoline. And yet today, their best car can only go 50 miles per gallon on a gallon of gasoline, or 1,000th the distance. If that was their claim, would you believe that they had a car 1,000 times better than they did today 50 years ago? Of course not. And that's what they're saying. NASA admits the farthest that they can send an astronaut is 250 miles above the Earth. And yet, which is 1,000th as far as they claim to have sent an astronaut 50 years ago with 50 years older technology. That's completely illogical. That alone proves they didn't go to the moon.
So they destroyed the technology from all the space missions that went to the moon, not just the Apollo 11 space mission, but every single one of them.
Correct.
Was it the same technology that they used throughout?
You can show that clip of the guy saying they destroyed the technology. There's a clip of Eugene Kranz. Not only did they destroy all the schematics, which could prove that the equipment couldn't leave Earth orbit, couldn't land on the moon, and so forth. That's why they destroyed it. Of course, if the equipment really worked, they would never destroy that investment. Proof of that is the 70-year-old B-52 that's still operational. And not only did they destroy the equipment and the blueprints and the electronic schematics, they destroyed all the telemetry data that could prove where the spacecraft actually was. They destroyed that. And they destroyed all the original videotapes because there was an, IMAX film that wanted to project them at something like, 6-8 times higher quality than they had ever been seen before. And right before they were to do that, they all mysteriously disappeared from the National Archives. Now, they have a copy of the Declaration of Independence that's over 240 years old in the same building. And yet somehow things that were like, 30, 40 years old and weighed about, I'm thinking about 2 tons worth of material, somehow mysteriously disappeared. Why would all that stuff disappear unless there was a cover up and that would prove it?
If this was a conspiracy, how many people would have to have been on the inside of this conspiracy to cover this up? Like all the scientists that were monitoring the flight in space that were at NASA that day, even video editors, all these different people. Like how many people would have to be on the inside of this thing and it's never leaked?
That's the argument that diehard fans who claim the moon landings are real, that they try to throw that out, but it's pretty straightforward. The atomic bomb had 145,000 people involved in it, but only about 8 knew what was actually going on, what they were building. It's through departmentalization. Do you really think the CIA is so stupid to tell the guy making the glove or the boot or the door handle, hey, by the way, we're really not going to the moon? Be sure not to tell anybody. The fact is, there were only 3 eyewitnesses to every flight, and they, of course, were government employees. And there was no independent press coverage whatsoever. Whatever pictures and video that they claimed was coming from the moon came from our federal government, which, as you know, is completely corrupt. And most investigators believe, including Robert Kennedy Jr., that the CIA killed President Kennedy. John McNamara admitted that the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which led to the death of over 1 million people, was completely contrived and made up. And of course, Building 7 of 9/11 proves that something other than an airplane was going on here, demolition or something, we don't know. We have 3,000 engineers who say those buildings, it's scientifically impossible for them to come down from kerosene fires from aircraft. And yet nothing is ever done about it. If they're willing to kill millions of people, right, I think they're willing to fake a TV picture.
Well, I'm still wondering about all the scientists and engineers that were in NASA that day actually tracking the trajectory of the Apollo 11. Like at some point in time, everybody would have had to know.
Well, actually, that's not the case. And the book talks about this. The Soviet Union had done the same thing. They launched an unmanned satellite to orbit the moon, and they transmitted voice to that spacecraft. And then from there, it was retransmitted back to Earth to make it appear that there were men on the spacecraft when there weren't. If you see the very beginning of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, there's a shot, a dolly shot going past all the ground controllers there at NASA before they go to the moon for the very first time, and like 10 seconds before they go, and they're all just kicked back watching television like everybody else. Gene Kranz, the flight director, and other computer operators said, we can tell no difference between a real flight and a simulation. In fact, they launched something called the Tetra A satellite to simulate transmissions coming from the moon so that they could, quote, rehearse the moon landings. Now, they claimed it crashed into the ocean. I believe that's a lie, so that it would still be up there faking the direction of the signals to make them believe that they were coming from the moon when they really weren't. Very few people knew. And of course, in the book that we have an eyewitness who was there at the time who described what he saw on his deathbed because he had been carrying that guilt around for the most of his life.
How would the events of that day unfold when the rocket launches and all the engineers that are sitting inside NASA are watching this and they're reading the data from the trajectory? Where are the actual astronauts? I'm assuming that they're in the rocket as well because of, and we'll get into the video later, but the video that they show of Earth from space while they're in low orbit. But then how did they shoot all the footage of them actually on the moon? Because people would have been kind of tracking this in real time. So was that then proposed to be shot in a separate studio, timed properly? And then who would those people have been? Because you can't see anybody's faces on the moon at that point in time because they're all wearing their shield protectors. Or how would those events have unfolded?
Well, I mean, for example, as you know, CNN during the Iraq War had a guy wearing a flat jacket and a helmet and claimed bombs were falling around him. And then the green screen was exposed to guys in Atlanta, Georgia, faking the whole thing. And for some reason, the FCC lets them, still operate. It's kind of funny. They were very, very easy to kind of fake this type of thing. In fact, former President Clinton, in his book, My Life, on page 156, basically says that he also doubts the authenticity of the moon missions because of television manipulation. We know from a source who was there, he was at the military base where Apollo 11 was filmed 1 year beforehand. He stood beside President Johnson holding television cables, and he was chief of security at this military base. He eyewitnessed them filming it 1 year in advance. So it's my opinion that when they were allegedly walking on the moon and during some of the flight time, they were doing audio live with an earpiece in so that they could kind of improvise things as they went along. The people who were allegedly walking on the moon, it looks like that was pre-recorded and then synchronized. We know from a unidentified classified reel that I got that there's a third track of audio. According to NASA, this is a public event. There's only two people on this radio, signal, NASA and the astronauts. But in fact, there was a third party prompting the astronauts how to fake photography and what to say. We have that on this tape, which at the beginning of it says very clearly, do not show to the public. And it's an unedited reel. And we show clearly that they are faking being halfway to the moon. So you have to wonder if they're faking being halfway to the moon, it means they can't go halfway. It means they cannot leave Earth orbit. And what a surprise, 50 years later, we can still not leave Earth orbit. So how could we possibly leave Earth orbit with equipment that was 50 years older than what we have today, which can still not leave Earth orbit? There are bases at the South Pole. The South Pole has temperatures minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 100-mile-per-hour winds. And guess what? There are bases there. You know why? Because it's humanly possible. If it were so easy to go to the moon with 1960s technology on the first attempt, they would have been on Mars 10 years later, and they'd be in another solar system by now, and there would be numerous bases on the moon. There are no bases on the moon simply because it cannot be done. If it could be done, just like the South Pole, they would be there.
So the audio track on the tape, and we'll get into the way that they shot the Earth in a second, but the audio track on the tape and when the talk command comes in, is it possible that talk command could have come in from someone like from one of the other astronauts, like talk?
Well, no, because you're doing this podcast show, you do editing of audio, you can tell the EQ, if you will, of the audio. There's the EQ of NASA. It sounds a particular way. There's an EQ sound, radio kind of sound of the astronauts. And of course, NASA kind of has that radio sound. And then this third party is crystal clear, right on top of a microphone. And they're basically prompting the astronauts to not speak to NASA until a 4-second delay goes by. Now, this is because this footage that they're faking, they claim to be halfway to the moon, when in fact they're still in Earth orbit. So if they were really halfway to the moon, there would be a radio delay of the signal going from NASA out to the astronauts and coming back. So if he answered right away, it would give away that he was very close to the Earth. So in their earpiece, they had the CIA telling them when to talk. And sure enough, NASA says, hello. Exactly 4 seconds go by. Then you hear talk. And Neil Armstrong starts speaking. They're creating this fake radio delay. Not only that, you see, this fake shot of allegedly the blue Earth floating in space. Now, it looks pretty convincing. I'm a filmmaker. It looks pretty convincing. However, I have the unedited version, which shows that it's a 1-foot model over a circular window in the spacecraft, and we catch them lying. They say that the lens is up against the window, as it would have to be to shoot the little Earth far away, when in fact it's at the back of the spacecraft. They turned out the lights, all of which they talk about openly, because they thought these private conversations would be edited out. And you see that they have constructed a 1-foot model of the Earth inside the spacecraft in Earth orbit. Now, if they really went to the moon, why would they be faking being halfway to the moon, right? It means they cannot go halfway. They cannot leave Earth orbit. And even people who believe the moon landings are real agree that this is fake footage of them faking being halfway to the moon. So the question is, if they really went to the moon, why would they fake any of it? Especially when people were already doubting the authenticity, they would get caught. If the Earth was really that far out the window, they would use it. Well, the people who still want to believe they went to the moon, even though there's this clear evidence of them faking photography, they say, well, they were just rehearsing. Well, they would just rehearse with the real Earth out the window and seeing how every ounce is precious weight to lift off the ground. They wouldn't bother bringing a fake Earth, floating in space if there was a real Earth floating in space out the window. Plus, we have the CIA prompting them not to speak until 4 seconds go by to create a fake radio delay. And when I showed, this footage to astronauts, they turned, red, got angry. And another one, when I talked to him about it and I said, hey, they're talking about your mission allegedly orbiting the moon, that you faked the shot the same way, he, turns pale white and literally runs away threatening to hit me. The thing is, if I really walked on the moon and someone thought otherwise, I would find that hysterically funny. And if someone asked me to swear in a Bible, I would say, sure, are you feeling okay? But Aldrin and these other astronauts act like I'm going up to them in front of their wife and saying, how's your mistress? I saw her over the other day. She says hello. And they get really mad because they do have a mistress. And the reason why they get really mad is because I'm exposing a real thing. And as you know from Astronauts Gone Wild, when I showed Edgar Mitchell this footage and he got very angry, physically assaulted me, threatened to shoot me. In the commotion, we, left a wireless microphone on him of very high quality. And my cameraman put the camera in the back of the rental car and it was still recording the private audio in the guy's house. And guess what? They're talking about calling the CIA to have me assassinated. If they really went to the moon and I'm some silly person who thinks otherwise, I don't think they would have to call the CIA to have me assassinated. Do you? The reason they would is because I'm exposing a real crime of the federal government. People don't realize how easy it is. Some people say, well, I believe they went to the moon because I saw it on television. No independent press coverage. They didn't even show live, television images during the landing. It said simulation, on the TV screen. They showed a fuzzy black and white picture, and that's their claim, that they went to the moon. All that they have is the testimony of government lying employees and alleged moon rocks. And when in fact one was examined, it turned out to be a piece of petrified wood. Yet no one asks the question, if the rocks are fake, what about the moon missions? And of course, that's because the media is run by the criminals who faked it and they don't want to expose it.
So one thing I like about the book, Moon Man, is that you wrote the book kind of interactively. So in the book, there are links to YouTube videos where you're prompted, okay, go ahead and go watch this link now. Go ahead and go watch that link now. And so back to the discussion we were having about them having the CIA, like they made a joke about the CIA waxing you, and then you made kind of, I'll call it a spoof video, retort to this where, I don't know. I guess you're just gonna have to watch the video. It's pretty funny, but yeah, you definitely had a good sense of humor about that kind of stuff. So, as I was reading the book and examining this and trying, like I always try to like step outside of something and take this like independent look at it. And in this case, I was trying to picture myself as like a judge saying, okay, what is circumstantial and what is not circumstantial? For example, like what is circumstantial and what is like truly damning evidence?
Well, let me interview you, Rich. Let me ask you this.
Oh, well, hold on. Let me make this point real quick. Hang on one second. I'll say this. The Astronauts Gone Wild videos. In a court of law, if I was a judge, I would say, well, this is circumstantial evidence because just because astronauts are getting angry or whatever, how many times has somebody stuck a camera in their face and said, you didn't land on the moon, and you get to a point 50 years later where you want to punch somebody, like, which is completely uncalled for. But I could say, well, that still doesn't necessarily prove.
Oh, I agree. I'm not claiming.
No, I know you. I know that. I know.
I'm not claiming that Astronauts Gone Wild proves that we didn't go to the moon. The only thing in there that I could say potentially proves that they didn't go to the moon is an Apollo astronaut threatening to have me assassinated by the CIA, which I don't see why they would do if they really went, and I'm just silly and believe otherwise.
No.
So I think that's proof. Let me ask you this. You've seen a funny thing happened on the way to the moon.
Yeah. You've
seen the classified footage of fake photography with the CIA prompting. You agree they're faking being halfway to the moon in that footage, right?
Oh, for sure. And this is the point that I was.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you agree that Apollo 11 is faking part of the photography of their mission, right?
100%.
Okay. Well, then why would they do that if they really went to the moon? Which means we do have proof. We do have proof. 4 out of 5 people who previously thought that the moon missions were real, when they watch a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, the window shot convinces them.
Yeah.
It convinced me. But, I mean, I describe in my book my horror when I found this classified footage, and it's like, it broke my heart. I'm thinking, is the world this wicked? Is the world this corrupt? Are they really that, arrogant? And, and they are.
Let me take a step back and explain why I'm thinking this way, because, you talk about, like when you talk about the moon landing as being a hoax, like there's a lot of people that are just, and you talk about the number of people that, I mean, people before, if you were talking about this 30 years ago, people would be like, man, you're just a kook, you're crazy. And that's just silly. And now there are more and more people that are like, yeah, and most people that maybe believe, don't believe, whatever, the non-believers still, most of them are like, maybe we did, maybe we didn't, or whatever. It's kind of like, I'll ask you this question. Do you believe there's any weight to a flat earth theory?
No, I think that's misdirection. I think the earth is a sphere. It's scientifically, logical for it to be that way. It's like a bubble, and the air always forms a sphere because of the equal pressure around it. Space is actually a form of matter yet to be detected. It puts equal pressure all around. It's a sphere. The thing is, when Bill Casey first went on Oprah and said we didn't go to the moon, they immediately said you must think the earth is flat. And sure, here I come along the scene and they say the same thing. I mean, if there's anybody out there who actually believes that the earth is flat, the only reason is because the world is so corrupt and we're lied to all the time. They're assuming that everything's a lie. That if you look at the word wicked, it comes from candle wick. And I thought a candle wick was one little strand, but I looked at it really close. It's 2 interwoven. So true wickedness is blending truth and lies together. People know they can be deceived by being told something that's being billed as the truth, like going to the moon, but in fact is a lie. But they forget the other way of being deceived, which is being told the truth, the earth is a sphere, or the moon landings are fake, and then they think the truth is a lie. And unfortunately, if people really believe that, they're simply throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There is no biblical proof that the earth is flat. People are just describing what they see in a poetic way, like Solomon called his girlfriend, had eyes of lilies and lips of pomegranates. That wasn't literal. Now, geography, by the way, for people who use God, that the earth is flat, is, not essential to salvation anyway. You have to choose your battles. The fact is, they're trying to make people who are exposing the moon landing fraud look all the more crazy. However, do what you do. People thought various things throughout history, and most of the time, if not all of the time, the initial thought is that the majority is always wrong.
I bring up the flat earth for two reasons. Number one, people that don't believe in the moon landing always, or not always, but oftentimes get clumped in with people that believe in a flat earth. And a flat,
well, that's what they want. That's the whole purpose of
exactly.
that psyop.
Exactly.
They were exposing a real crime of the federal government, and they want to make those people look crazy to discredit them. The fact is, even though the moon landing fraud probably killed the fewest number of people of many, disastrous government frauds, it would be the most embarrassing for the federal government if it came out. I mean, if one of the astronauts confessed on national TV it was a fake, it would break people's hearts, and then they will go, well, what else are they lying about? So it's the one thing that some even alleged conspiracy theorists, if that's what they really are, or alternative media people, refuse to talk about because maybe they're not who they appear. And so this is the one thing the government is most concerned about. And as you know, from chapter, I think it is 11 in the book, the Apollo 1 fire, from the dead man's own family and hundreds of hours of investigation, they absolutely are certain that that fire was set deliberately. So when and if the truth comes out that the moon landings are indeed falsified, the very next thing they're going to investigate is the Apollo 1 fire, where the CIA deliberately murdered the crew that would have been the first crew to walk on the moon because they wouldn't cooperate with the fraud.
This is the reason why I'm going down this questioning line, because what your book does is it does a good job of establishing. Look, people talk about the moon landing being a hoax, and automatically, like people have heard this stuff, so they're just like, oh, whatever. Yeah, I've heard this before. I've heard about the wrinkles in the spacesuit, and whatever, blah blah blah, and then they kind of automatically turn this off. But when you look at things like you're talking about Apollo 1 right now, and what your book does is it establishes a motive. Just like if you were trying a court case, you need to establish a motive for something to happen. And so it establishes a good motive as to why the U.S. government would have done this. I mean, for example, it's the 60s, right? I mean, we have there's so much turmoil going on in the country. We're in a war we shouldn't have been in. We have the civil rights movement going on. It's complete chaos. The Russians are beating us in the space race, as you pointed out earlier. And the United States is looking bad on a global scale. So we got to step up and do something. Kennedy makes these claims, and now it's something that we can't back down from. We have this whole pride issue going on. And then when you look at some of we can call it circumstantial evidence if you want to, like the Apollo 1 fires, and there was a statement in your book, I think this was also in chapter 11, and I didn't know this. First of all, I didn't know about the Apollo 1 fire until I read the book, but I also didn't know about that. You said that there were 10 non-space related astronaut deaths prior to the Apollo 11 mission.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so when you're looking at this kind of stuff that's going on outside of the moon landing, we still haven't even gotten to the shadows in the picture and all this kind of stuff, or really fully assessed the angle of the camera and all that. These kind of very, very hardcore facts that when you establish this kind of stuff and you start looking at what was going on in the deaths of all these previous astronauts who had died on non-space related incidences. And it's like, okay, well, what was really going on in the space program at that point in time? And the problem is that in your book, when you talk about you said if the public found out, they would revolt. I don't know if they would. I don't know if the public would revolt because we're so used to, like you talk about CNN faking the bombs in Afghanistan. Recently, with last year, there was I think it was NBC that got caught using footage from a hospital in Italy, claiming that it was a hospital in New York, and then they said, "Oh, well, that was an editing error." And you, obviously being a producer and me having worked in production, know how difficult it is to make an editing error like that because the filing system that you use for different production clips and videos, they go into such an intricate system so that you can find these things that you can't just accidentally pull up one file and insert that like that. In my opinion, that would have had to have been looked for. So in these instances when these things happen and the news, like NBC was caught red-handed and CNN was caught red-handed, people are just like, does this take food off of my plate? The problem with the moon landing is, as you pointed out in the book, let me finish real quick. As you point out in the book, the problem with the moon landing is that when you start looking at the number of lives that were affected by this, like the Apollo 1, these astronauts, if the astronaut really was taken out of the equation because he was speaking publicly about this, and not just his life but all the other lives, the amount of tax money that was taken from the American public, which it's like, well, they got us. But it's the question is what did they do with that tax money? What other kind of wars or what else could they have funded? That could have happened. And when you start looking at all these things, this is way more than just we faked the moon landing. This crumbles the entire system by which we live. Like every belief that you have about the United States government would suddenly just topple over if an astronaut was to come out on public television and say something like that. And I don't think people would realize that. And I wouldn't even have realized that. I'd be like, oh, well, they didn't land on the moon. And then what, you go about your life at that point in time. But no, when you start looking at the implications of everything that was involved with this, it's like that runs deep, real deep.
Well, I see exactly what you're saying. The thing is, I don't think people really are going, oh, well, they faked 9/11. Oh, well, they killed Kennedy. Oh, well, they faked, a news broadcast. I don't think that's the case because the people who run the news is the CIA, and they're not using the media, as Kennedy said it was the purpose of, was to keep the government in check. So they're making it appear like no one cares about all this fraud, just like they made it appear that people were walking on the moon when they weren't. The fact is, the people who run the media are the same ones who faked the moon landing, faked 9/11, killed Kennedy. It's entirely run by the CIA. Carl Bernstein, who broke Watergate, found a document in the 1970s. In the 1970s, it said there were 400 journalists working for the CIA. They worked for ABC, NBC, CBS, Time Magazine, Reuters, Associated Press. They worked for everybody. And that was when there was regulation in place that says, you can only own 2 TV stations. Now that has been deregulated. Now propaganda is legally allowed, even though faking of the moon landing violated numerous laws, including one that says you cannot use television to deceive people, which came about because of the quiz show scandal. And these people are running the show. People do care, but they make it appear, because they run the media, that people don't care. I mean, they could have 99% of the public against something, but what they would do is they would interview 10 people of the 1% and make it look like, no, everyone's, for this event that people are really against. They can do anything that they want. I was watching every episode of Mary Tyler Moore last year because, unfortunately, Ed Asner, who just passed away, was about to star in my first feature film. God bless him. Nevertheless, I saw this episode that he was in where they had a snowstorm, okay, and their film crew was stuck in traffic in the snowstorm, and they couldn't get the traffic jam footage in time for the news. So one guy said, well, why don't we just use the traffic jam footage from last year? And Azur's like, you can't do that. We'll lose our FCC license for that little thing they're concerned about. And yet when CNN fakes being in Iraq when they're in Atlanta, nobody is penalized. I mean, it's just amazing. Imagine if you had 3,000 aerospace engineers saying that the moon landings were fake. I mean, imagine that. They don't say that because going to the moon is their God. But in any case, you have 3,000 people, professionals, risking their reputation, saying 9/11, those buildings did not come down by airplanes, especially the third one that half the public don't even know about. And yet nothing is done about it. I mean, these people, and you're right, I just recorded the audiobook of the book that you read. I just finished it yesterday. And as I'm reading my own book, I'm like, boy, do I let the U.S. government have it.
Man, I'm honestly, Bart, I'm not lying when I'm reading your book. Like, as I was reading your book and I was thinking about us doing this podcast, I was like, I'm kind of like looking over my shoulder here, like, man, do I have some CIA agents like standing outside my door or something like that? I even got a little nervous. And I'll say this, relating to all the media and all that kind of stuff. On your YouTube channel on the Moon Man links, you have a great video that shows how coordinated news media can be. With messaging, and not even crucial messaging. Like I had posted, I don't know if I actually posted, I saw a post of one on social media recently that was, concerning the recent pandemic and how the news media coordinates a statement, and it's the identical wording. But you have one that has like several different phrases. One of the ones that stuck in my mind was the Easter Bunny may have lost a spring in his step this year due to the economic downturn. And it's that line that's delivered from news stations across the United States that you show. It's the exact same line, and there's no way that Channel 5 in LA would do the same thing as Channel 9 in Kansas City. Identical wording, and people see this and they're just like, they kind of scoff at it. And what was interesting to me as I was watching that is that you actually propose a theory in your book that during the whole 9/11 situation and when the plane crashed into the Pentagon, that the $2.3 trillion that came up missing at that time was possibly used to purchase all these communication and media companies.
Oh, they did that a long time ago. I mean, CNN sold, I believe, for $7 billion, which is one half the cost of one aircraft carrier. The government, the CIA has been using, fake fronts for a long time. I mean, it's not a secret that the Defense Authorization Research Project Agency, DARPA, that develops secretive technology, they founded Google. They founded it. It's an open admission. They own YouTube. I mean, that's why if you say anything against the current event, the Kennedy assassination, they could care less about, or 9/11 or the moon landing, but they want everybody to get this medical procedure. And if you say anything, because that's a current event, they want to control what people think because it controls their actions. A third of the book is about, here's how and why the moon landings are fake. A third is about my espionage adventures that I've never talked about publicly.
Yeah, which we haven't even gotten into yet.
Yeah. And then a third, and, I'm reading it out loud, is, just rebuking the federal government and governments in general. And it's unbelievable how deeply they are entrenched. They control everything. You're right. They bought up Facebook. They bought up YouTube. They bought up Google. I believe they bought up AT&T and all these things. When you click on, I want Yahoo email or whatever, it says you agree to the terms of service. And if you don't, you can't have it. And what are the terms of service? The right to scan your correspondence, which is to read them. Because they own the hardware, they believe they have the right to inspect it, which is to eavesdrop. They're basically criminals who write laws to make their crimes legal.
Let me reel us back in a little bit here, because now we've talked about the modern the present day climate of things, like all this corruptions, conspiracy theories, and then people that are sitting there are going to be like, oh man, this is a crazy conversation. These people that don't believe in any of this stuff. But just to put things into context for you, this, like, we started this conversation off about the moon landing and how the moon landing could be falsified. And for you were a kid that was born on an Air Force base, pretty much, at your youth, like really, you looked up to her. I hate to use the word idolize, but I'll use the word idolize, like all things flight, because your father was in the Air Force at the time. And then at a young age, you were kind of like, wait a minute, and you started questioning things. And for you to question your beliefs, to question a system that you completely believed in, has begun this rabbit hole. It's not like you're this person that just hated the moon landings to begin with and started questioning things. And in your, because you're an investigative journalist, in your investigation, you realize how much of this is due to corruption, and it applies across the board. That you're talking about how it can apply to 9/11, how it can apply to the current climate in the world and all that kind of stuff and everything that's going on. And so, just to kind of put things into context, like when you start talking about conspiracy theories, and you start talking about like corruption and stuff like that, for people that are, like if you're sitting here like, oh, this is just a crazy conversation. And so I'll use their media against them. Look up, if you will, the unethical human experimentation in the United States. Look at that. It's a Wikipedia page. Look that Wikipedia page up and look at some of these unethical experiments that were going on. When you talk about corruption and people would never do that. I'll choose one right here. Operation Green Run in 1948, operation called the Green Run. The U.S. Atomic Engineering Commission (AEC) released iodine-131 and xenon-133 into the atmosphere near Hartford site in Washington, which contaminated 500,000 acre, 2,000 square kilometers area containing 3 small towns. Now, they did this knowing, like, obviously this was unethical. They knew what was going on. They knew that this was going to be harmful to people, and they did it anyway. And we live in this world where these kinds of things happen. When things like this happen, you actually have a foundation to begin questioning the system. And that's the whole point here to any of the listeners. So what I would encourage anybody listening to is to listen to this conversation with an open mind, because when you see the video of them in low orbit, for example, shooting the Earth inside the aircraft, or the spacecraft or whatever, then it's like it's one of those scratch your head moments. Like you're trying to figure out like, how can I explain away this situation, or do I just let my cognitive dissonance just rule my thought process here?
Well, if you believe in God, let me refresh everyone's memory of a particular scripture. When Jesus was being tempted by the devil after 40 days of fasting, the devil said that if Jesus bowed down to him, he would give him all the kingdoms of the world because they belong to the devil, and he can give them to anyone he wants. So the devil runs the world at the moment. Can't you tell? Child molestation, homicide, genocide. Okay. So do you think the devil's going to give the kingdoms of the world to good people or to evil people? So it's a fact that evil people run the world. That's just the way that it is. Vanderbilt University deliberately put radioactive particles in pregnant women's food to see if the babies would be deformed. And they were deformed. They did it openly, and they admit that they did it. Vanderbilt University is still around. The Church of Rome admits. John Paul II, he said, "Oh yeah, by the way, the Catholic Church did kill 50 to 100 million people over the course of about 700 years for either owning a Bible or keeping the Saturday Sabbath. Yes, we're sorry, but they're still around." Can you imagine someone saying, "Oh yeah, by the way, this person molested, thousands of children, and they're still a babysitter"? Can you imagine that? That's what we have going on now. The people, CNN is still in business. They're bought up and run. It's not a coincidence that that the CIA's philosophy and CNN's philosophy are exactly the same. In fact, I point out in my book, some independent journalistic agency did a survey of, get this, 1,500 newspapers, TV stations, and whatever. And they were all 100% for the CIA overthrowing the democratically elected government of Venezuela. Now, how is that even possible? That every single news outlet, is pro-CIA overthrowing a democracy, unless the CIA owns and runs those newspapers and TV stations, which they do. I mean, they run the show. It's amazing. And when you saw that clip, yeah, it was talking about, what do they call it? A padded story. But the point is, you see in the lower left and right corner, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, they're repeating the same script word for word because it comes from the top. And I worked in news for 2 years. The people do what they're told. They read what they're told to read. If they don't, they're fired. And they are prestigious jobs and they pay well and they're going to do what they're told. That's just the way that it is.
Let's go back to the actual landing itself. Let's talk about some of the hard evidence. We talked about the video, how they're shooting inside of the capsule. Talk about the photo with the shadows. Talk about the spacesuit. Let's talk about the Van Allen radiation belt as well.
So here's a picture I took about a half a mile away during sunlight. Okay. The sun is about 1 million times bigger in volume than the Earth, and it's about 93 million miles away. So when it casts shadows, it's going to cast shadows in the same direction over an entire continent and over the moon in the same direction. So natural sunlight produces parallel shadows. They will never, ever intersect. All you got to do is go outside on a clear day, have you and your friends stand about 5 feet apart from one another, and you'll see that your shadows never intersect. Here's a picture allegedly taken on the moon. Here's an astronaut shadow, and here's a shadow from a rock about 5 feet away, and they're intersecting at almost 90 degrees. This is impossible for this to take place in sunlight. This can only take place with electrical light. This is the only proof you need to prove that the moon landings are fake. And this is in one of the later missions. I believe this is from Apollo 15.
The photo on the moon is from Apollo 15, you're saying, yes?
I believe so. This is from Apollo 15. So here's an astronaut shadow. Here's a shadow of a rock. They're going at 90 degrees when, if they were in sunlight, like they claimed, in fact, the moon has no atmosphere. So it's supposed to be 20 times brighter than on Earth. So the last thing you would need would be an electrical light. But I'm a filmmaker. My job is to make fake scenes look real. I use electrical lights all the time to simulate sunlight, sunrises, sunsets, things like that. So I can tell you with 100% certainty, this photograph was taken with electrical light. That's why the shadows intersect. The only proof that you need that the moon landings are fake is this one picture, because it is simply impossible for shadows from objects 5 feet apart from one another to intersect at 90 degrees in sunlight, which means it was not taken in sunlight, which means it was taken with electrical light, which means it's on the Earth and not the moon.
If this was taken with electrical light, I mean, obviously, because you do production, then there had to be two light sources for this. Because
there could be two, or sometimes it's one light source, but it's, small and close. So if you're standing on the left side of the light, it would cast a shadow one direction. If you're standing, or this rock is on the right side of the light, then it could cast it in a different direction. In any case, it's not sunlight. Therefore, it's not on the moon. Pretty crystal clear.
In one of the Moon Man videos that was linked to the book, NASA did a demonstration with that. And instead of using the sun, they actually decided to do it at night with an artificial light.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty funny. When the National Geographic did a special trying to prove my, moon film wrong. And they went out into a desert at night. In fact, I could show you a clip of that if you want to see it. They went out to a desert at night. So basically, they went out to a desert at night and they used one big spotlight and put an actor in an astronaut suit and basically said, hey, look, the shadows do intersect. Therefore, my, argumentation is wrong. Well, in fact, they actually proved me right, because they're simulating the Apollo pictures with an electrical light. And they say, look, they intersected almost 90 degrees. Therefore, the point in my film is wrong. They're actually proving me right, because they prove that the shadows intersect with an electrical light. So they matched the Apollo pictures with an electrical light, which means the Apollo pictures were taken with an electrical light. I mean, all they had to do.
Why wouldn't NASA have replicated this in the day when there was actual sun?
Well, yeah, all they had to do is go to the same desert 12 hours earlier and do it in sunlight. If they really wanted to simulate the sunlit conditions on the moon, they would have just gone to the desert during the day, and they would have seen quite clearly that the shadows would be parallel, just like in this picture, right? They would have been parallel and they would have never intersected. So what they did is they went to a desert at night, and they simulated allegedly the surface of the moon with an electrical light, and the shadows intersected. And yet they said, this proves me wrong, when it's the very thing that proves me right. That the reason why the shadows intersect in their demonstration is because it was taken with an electrical light, which means the Apollo pictures were also taken with electrical light. They said they couldn't simulate the sun, but they could. All they had to do is go to the same desert 12 hours earlier in sunlight and have their astronauts stand there, and the shadows would have never intersected. So it's amazing. They were trying to prove me wrong, and yet they actually proved me right. And yet they deceived the audience and said the very evidence that proves me right proves me wrong. I mean, it's remarkable, the deception.
Bart, you're a production, like you're a producer. Why not go to the same spot in the desert they went? 12 hour, during the sunlight, and just stand there the whole day and show how the sun rising and setting, that the shadows will never intersect each other.
Well, my point is not to prove people who think the moon landings are real wrong. I don't have time for that. People send me clips. Here's a 10-minute rebuttal of your film. Or
yeah, I gotcha.
I don't have time. I'm not going to waste my life watching people who believe that their God walked on the moon when they didn't. The fact is that the reason why they can't see this plain, simple truth that the moon landings are fake, even though we have footage which shows them fake photography right in front of their eyes, is because the moon landing is a god to them. They will not even consider it at all, not even 1%. They will not consider the possibility that it was fake.
Well, it's like the Bible says, even there'll come the great deception. Even the very elect would be blind, blinded to it.
Yeah, in 1 Thessalonians, I think chapter 2, it says that there will be counterfeit miracles in the last days. Now, if you want to hear, the CIA talking, here it is right here. Okay, so you could see that there was a 4-second delay, and that talk was a different place, different location, different audio EQ. Now, what they're claiming is that this is the Earth floating in space, and this proves that there's some great distance away from it. They said that they had their lens of their camera right up against the glass of the spacecraft window in order to shoot the Earth floating in space.
And the astronauts actually said that in the audio when they were talking.
Correct.
When they were talking,
they have to, because those were the segments that were broadcast to the public. And of course, if you really were far away from the Earth and wanted to film it, you'd have to have the lens right up against the glass. But the camera is actually at the back of the spacecraft, which we'll see. This is a circular window of the spacecraft from Earth orbit, and you're either seeing a section of the Earth out the window, or some believe that they put a transparency, like a color X-ray, basically a color photograph transparency of the Earth taken from an unmanned probe. And you can see that very clearly. I mean, here's a part right here where an astronaut's arm gets in front of the window, proving that it's a 1-foot model of the Earth.
Convincing. If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
North America becomes invisible because beyond the Terminator is that shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Yeah. See white bands of major clouds across the Earth.
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up, and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window.
So Neil Armstrong in this image, the part that was shown to the public, just said that he's 130,000 miles away from the Earth. And it certainly looks like that because this is allegedly the blackest space and this is allegedly the Earth. They even put a little piece of crescent material into the window. But here in this footage, the outtakes, you can actually see, it's the same proportion, it's the same Earth, when in fact it's a 1 foot model using the window, as a rear projection for a transparency of the Earth, right? Over here is 130,000 miles out. And over here is where you see it's really the window. And it's a 1 foot model of the Earth. This is absolute proof that the crew of Apollo 11 is faking being halfway to the moon. So then you have to ask yourself, if they're faking being halfway to the moon, it means they couldn't go halfway, which means they cannot leave Earth orbit, which, what a surprise, 50 years later, with 50 years better technology, they still cannot leave Earth orbit.
I want to circle back to your book, because in the book, what you have in the book is a source that you have waited until your source passed away in order to reveal some information in the latter parts of the book that gave 15 names. I'm obviously not going to spoil that for any of the listeners here. If you want that information, you can go to the book and check it out. But can you just set up the context of all this for the readers to pique their interest, so to speak?
Yeah, basically there are two major things that are discussed in the book that I've never discussed publicly, one of which is many more espionage, CIA misadventures than just having the threat. At one time, I was kidnapped. I was drugged. I escaped. They gave me some sort of truth serum, interrogated me. I urinated in a cup, had a friend bring that urine specimen to a lab. When we called the lab to get the report, they told us there was a break-in over the weekend, and the only thing stolen was my urine sample. There's a lot of crazy things like that going on. And the main thing is that I have a source who was actually there at the military base where Apollo 11 was filmed in June of 1968. I disclose in the book the official code name for the real Apollo project, as well as the name of the military base and 15 names, because this person was chief of security. And he was given this list of names and said only these people are allowed to enter to witness the faking of the moon landing. President Johnson is on that list and 14 other people, some of whom are still alive today. This person was chief of security at this particular base. He confessed this on his deathbed, including, and I don't think I mentioned this in the book, he also confessed that he had killed a coworker to keep it a secret. Now, he justified, to himself that, well, they must have had a really good reason why they did this. However, it really brought him to tears when he saw a year later on TV this shot that was claiming to be on the moon, when in fact it was at his military base filmed a year earlier. So this confession is, gone into detail in the book. And so now we know where Apollo 11 was filmed. We know the code name for the project, and we have a list of 15 people who were there at the time. Now, I was verifying all of this details about a year ago with my source and a relative of the deceased person. And shortly after doing that, my source's, relative, his house was broken into. And everything about his relative who was there at the time, all that was stolen and nothing else. Then 2 days after that, another 2 government visitors actually met him in person and said that if he talked to me ever again, they would kill him and his family. Subsequently, I called the White House. I talked to the press secretary. I talked to a United States senator on the Intelligence Committee and to the FBI to, protect this person from these rogue elements of the CIA. I also talked to 2 people who were on that list who didn't give very convincing defensive as to why they were there at the time. So all this is in the book Moon Man. Like I said, about a third of it is why and how we didn't go to the moon. A third is these crazy, behind the scenes adventures that I had, including naming the base where it was filmed, the code name, and the list of 15 people who were there, some of whom are alive. And then, like you said, it's a general indictment of the federal government and governments in general, because, this, despicable despotism that's controlling our government is pretty much controlling almost every government of the world. It's being supervised by people at the top who have their agenda, which is to get rid of 93% of the people of the world. That they openly said so.
When I read this book, was it kind of, people often think like, oh, the JFK assassination, that's a conspiracy theory. The moon landings, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. Oh, the with this pandemic you're talking about, that's a conspiracy theory. But your book kind of establishes I don't know if motive is the right word, but how this is it's just corruption at the highest levels and how all these things are interconnected in essence.
And that's what I realized when I put in the secret tape and I saw them faking part of the mission right in front of my eyes with the CIA telling them how to do it. It just broke my heart that this is the world that we live in, but it is the world that we live in. Corrupt people run the world. 75% of Americans agree that Oswald did not kill Kennedy. And they said, I don't know, in the 90s that they were going to release the Kennedy assassination files in 2017. But if you read the actual law, it says we will release them in 2017 unless the current president at that time decides not to. What's the point of even writing a law like that anyway? And they must have had something on Trump, because, if he can't even release something that happened 50 years ago because it will bring down the government, then those people are threatening him, blackmailing him, or whatever is going on. The fact is, I showed this footage of fake photography to an NBC news director. They turned pale white. They collapsed in their chair. They put their hand over their mouth and said, "Oh my God, this absolutely proves they didn't go to the moon." And I said, "Yeah, what do we do about it?" He thought for a moment, and then he said, "I cannot air this. It will cause a civil war. I do not want to be responsible for that." 10, 20 years later, another NBC producer agreed equally. They said, "This tape proves they didn't go to the moon. We're going to air it nationwide." They were contacted by government officials and told not to do it. Why? Because it would bring down the system. Well, that's a good thing. If the truth about corruption brings down a corrupt government, then the truth is doing its job. And that's why they ridicule people who are exposing their crimes. The fact is, half of all crimes are conspiracies. Half are done in the heat and the emotion of the moment without planning, and half are planned in advance. They're conspiracies. That's what the word means. It's in the Bible multiple times. People were conspiring to kill kings throughout the Bible. And believe me, wicked people run the world. And in order to do that, they have plans. You can call that conspiracy or whatever. It's simply uncovering crimes. And so the problem is that these criminals run the news media. They own it all. They own telecommunication. They own, social media. And that's why there's so much censorship, right? So there you go.
Well, listen, if you want to hear more about Bart's tales of espionage and more evidence on the moon landing hoax, moon landing fraud, in his condemnation of the government and how these things can interconnect, check out his book, Moon Man. Bart, where can they get the book, Moon Man?
If you go to Sibrel.com, Sibrel.com, you'll have a link for the print version, for the Kindle version, and the audiobook version, all available immediately.
All right, final question for the day, Bart. Other than Buzz Aldrin, have you ever been punched in the face by anybody else? I'm asking you this because I got punched in the face. It was part of my job hazard.
Maybe my sister when I was 12. Well, I think that's about it.
Okay, well, maybe on one occasion you deserved it, and on the other you did not. But
I'm sure. Well, most of the time, I'm sure I deserve it. But and I since apologized to Buzz Aldrin. I'm doing my best to be a Christian, but it's a learning experience. Yeah. I'm in school. I go to the principal's office about once a year for doing something wrong, and the Bible says not to rebuke an older man harshly. That's what I did. And I apologized. I shouldn't have spoke to him in that harsh manner. I do believe what I said. At the same time, I need to have compassion on him as well. And he immediately bought a copy of the film, the day I apologized. I'm doing my best and even asking people to swear on the Bible. Someone showed me that the Bible says not to take an oath. I wasn't aware of that at the time. And so if I were to do it again, I probably wouldn't even make Astronauts Gone Wild. However, as some of the followers of this, story have indicated, it's a good historical record to see how these people reacted. They were given the opportunity to come clean, but they refused to do it. It's pretty sad state when the heroes of our country are actually traitors. But that's what we have. And we have a news media that, unless they're reporting about the weather, they pretty much say the exact opposite of the truth all the time.
I don't know. I'd say sometimes the weather people are so inaccurate. That's not the truth either.
Well, about a hurricane or tornado or something,
I'll say this as a fellow Christian: if you're only in the principal's office once a year, you're doing okay. Because I think I'm in there like on a weekly basis. So, Bart, thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it so much.
Sure, Rich. You take care.
Quite Franklin is providing this podcast as a public service, but it is neither a legal interpretation nor legal advice, nor a statement of Quite Franklin policy. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation of that product or entity by Rich Franklin or Quite Franklin. The views expressed by guests on the podcast are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by Quite Franklin employees or representatives are the views and opinions of the persons expressing them, and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Quite Franklin or any of its officials or principals. Nothing heard on this podcast at any time is medical advice or is intended as medical advice. The listener must always consult his or her personal physician or other qualified medical professional regarding any questions of a medical nature. If you have any questions about this disclaimer, please contact our general counsel.